much for coming and supporting the journal. It's a very exciting event that we're hosting now because it signifies that we've been going for a full 70 years. And I thought you might like to see
Hmm.
this is issue number one from
Oh.
1955 with some quite interesting
Mm.
subjects on the function of countertransference, loathsome women, not sure what that one's about,
Aren't
the,
you?
fa the father archetype in feminine psychology, and this is a very forethinking one on cybernetics and analytical psychology.
Mm.
So that was issue number one in 1955. I'm going to give you a little bit of housekeeping before going further. Can I ask everybody to mute themselves so that we don't have any sound distractions to James and John when they speak? Next, because we have such a large number of people and at least three screens, possibly four, I won't see you if you simply raise your hand like this. So can I ask you, when we get to the questions, to go to the bottom of your screen where it has a button named React, and when you click that, there will be an option which says Raise Hand. If you raise the emoji hand, you will move to the top of the screen and the left, and we will be able to see that you want to speak. So if I can ask you by the time we get to questions to do that. So next, I'm going to introduce James and John. They hardly need any introduction, do they? Because they're both so very well known to the journal, and they've both been contributing in a variety of different ways and editorial ways for very many years. So we couldn't have anyone better to speak to us than both of them. James is going to begin, and as author of Michael Fordham, Innovations in Analytical Psychology, he is the ideal person to start because Michael Fordham was our first editor. And then John is going to take over from him as the JAP's first American editor, co-editor, and he will be telling us about the last 35 years. So over to you, James.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to have you with us.
My theme, and I will develop it as I go along, is that the history of the journal and the SAP are intertwined. To understand one, we have to understand the other. The raison d'etre for the SAP was the need to have an organization with its own training, independent of Zurich. And this was not a criticism, although it was sometimes thought that, of what was happening in Zurich, so much as a wish to explore Jung's idea from a clinical perspective, a difference of emphasis. And necessarily, this required studying published case material and clinical studies, even if they were organized within a different theoretical framework. And the source for much of this was from the psychoanalysts initially. And the initial response to this from the Zurich-trained early SAP members was that the real Jung, in quotations, was being ignored for a hybrid of analytical psychology and psychoanalysis. And at the center of this discussion was the relationship between the personal and the collective unconscious, which implicitly refers us to the split between Jung and Freud and Jung's 1912 volume, Symbols of Transformation. Jung's focus after the explosion of the publication of this work became more and more on the collective unconscious and Freud's the personal. We at the SAP felt that the need to understand the personal in such a way that it was not split off from the collective. The clinical analytical distinction here was that it was thought that the problems of the first half of life, the area of interest to Freudians, was best dealt with by a reductive approach, and the issues of the second half by Jung's synthetic method. I don't know if we still discuss these matters, but much was written in the early days about this. Whether it's still a useful distinction, I'm not so sure. Jung, writing about this, was very quick to join in and point out that archetypes were very seductive, and analyst and patient could easily be drawn into them. And of course, the seemingly impersonal is full of relevant personal material. Teasing out which was especially difficult because the personal arises out of the collective. And into this melee, stimulated by Fordham, came the seminal paper from a supervisor of mine, Mary Williams, with her two formulations, which has underpinned our approach in London ever since. Nothing in the personal experience needs to be repressed unless the ego feels threatened by its archetypal power. Part one. Part two, the archetypal activity which forms the individual's myth is dependent on materials supplied by the personal unconscious. And these two formulations underpinned the SAP's clinical approach and their writings, to start with, certainly. But where were we going to publish? Where were we going to publish our findings? The existing Jungian journals, Spring and Harvest, were not primarily interested in papers that compared unconscious fantasy with archetypes. And Fordham, who had become involved in promoting discussions within the medical section of the BPS, laid the ground for the publication of our papers in that journal. But inevitably, this gave rise to discussions within the SAP for a need to have our own clinically based Jungian journal that would enable authors to publish their clinical research, knowing that the theoretical organization of their case studies could be contained within a Jungian framework. These discussions and the direction the SAP and the JAP was taking at this time was in a climate of opinion very different from that which exists now. Bob Hobson, who was the chair in '57, wrote, "The unique and important role of analytical psychology in encompassing both the exact scientific explanatory approach and the holistic intuitive understanding attitude bring with it particular difficulties and special sources of conflict." He was not wrong. Fordham was our first editor, and he wrote that it arose the journal out of the vitality of the members. But what he was really wanting to tell us was that the aim of the journal was to increase the influence of analytical psychology and provide a forum for clinical, theoretical, and technical exploration of Jung's concepts and methods. We were financed by the Mellon family through the Bollingen Foundation, Mary Mellon having been a patient of Jung's. Fordham made three things clear in pressing for the start of the journal. First of all, that Jung's concepts were capable of useful elaboration. Secondly, that there was insufficient recorded case material. And thirdly, there was a wide gap that separated analytic concepts and procedures from classical psychiatry. Fordham, as an editor, had begun at the instigation of Herbert Reed, who had been approached by Jung, to set out how the collective works should be published. It was really a conceptual form of editing. He wasn't at that stage doing a lot of the detailed work, but he set out how the work should be separated. In other words, he agreed that the papers should be arranged in subject matter, which enabled that a topic that Jung returned to over the years could be gathered together in one volume. And Fordham chose which papers should be grouped into which volumes. So that was the editorial background that he came back to, that he came from when we started the journal. And it was Hull who translated the German at that stage, and Adler checked the translations. So taking on the editorship of a new journal seemed to be quite a natural fit. But this wasn't achieved without a struggle. C.A. Meyer, a well-known Zurich analyst, wanted to be co-editor with Fordham. Fordham wasn't having that. He rejected that proposal. Following on from decisions to have a journal and Fordham as the editor, The Europeans suggested that the title should be The British Journal, and again he rejected that. The journal's editor's objective was not just to provide interest to its readers, but also to stimulate the analytic community to publish their ideas on a wide international, but to stimulate the analytic community to publish their ideas by drawing on a wide international community to promote a sense of basic unity amongst analysts, which distance tends too often to make us neglect, pervert, or overlook. It didn't quite have that effect, actually. Fordham anticipated that this would make the different groups more aware of one another, something that the IAAP conferences brought into sharper focus. But what it also did, very noticeably, was show up the dividing lines. And the tensions were mainly between the Zurich analysts and the London analysts. Franz Richtling in Zurich, who had a role on the International Association, and Adler were critical of Fordham and wanted papers reflecting their approach. They wanted the journal to be an international journal, not a London one, and they wanted publication of papers in languages other than English. Contrary to the preconceptions of those who had issues with Fordham's interest in childhood and psychoanalysis, the journal, from its inception, published material that referenced a wide spectrum of analytic practice and theory, and the advisory board, interesting this, was made up of well-known classical analysts, Joe Henderson, Eric Neumann, Esther Harding, and James Kirsch. During these early years, Fordham followed a somewhat risky approach, which I'm sure the editors who are here today would agree with. He solicited papers as a way to get the journal started. And as we all know, the problem with asking someone to write a paper is it's very difficult to decide not to publish it if the paper's not good enough. These tensions and divisions between Zurich and London are often referred to as coming to a head in the 62 IAAP conference when Murray Jackson gave his paper on symbol formation and the delusional transference. Esther Harding was the discussion, and she thought that Jackson didn't understand what Jung had meant by a symbol. If you read Jackson's paper, it becomes clear that his concern was with the infant and child's capacity to symbolize and how this is connected to loss and separation. His interest was in child development and its relation to what's possible in analysis. Jackson was, of course, influenced by the clinical material Fordham was regularly presenting to the society, and at these meetings where Jung's hypothesis of an original self was being shown to be present in small children. These were the early days of Fordham's research into the self in childhood. And if you add to his hypothesis, which was not actually confirmed until many years later in the SAP infant observation seminars, that Jung's postulate of the original self had a dynamic he called deintegration and reintegration, we had a model which linked the stage of depressive concern and individuation, a bridge between the psychoanalytic developmental model and the analytical psychological approach. Individuation was therefore shown to be a characteristic not only of the second half of life, but also the first. These conference discussions were certainly lively and often referred to as the two sides were having a row. And following on from this, some people think that Fordham moved the journal more towards the developmental approach, as the classical group called our use of the couch and frequent sessions. Barbara Wharton has suggested that this is what stimulated Fordham to ask Mary Williams to write the paper I referred to earlier. This is really quite likely. I was in a group of young child analysts in the late 70s and early 80s, and we repeatedly urged Fordham to set out the problems inherent in Neumann's view of the child. And the consequence of that was he published his paper on Neumann and childhood. So Fordham was aware of issues of this kind that needed well, clarification or certainly investigation. You may remember that in this paper, Fordham noted that Neumann's phylogenetic formulations run into difficulties when translated into ontological equivalence, because Neumann's child bore little resemblance to an actual child. His main criticism, however, of Neumann was that his speculations concerning the development of the ego and ego consciousness were adultomorphic projections. Now, the interest in the development of the self and the detailed reporting of transference phenomena with descriptions of analytical practices were what the journal opened up a forum for. But the lines were being drawn because were papers going to set out a problem, provide clinical evidence, demonstrate through interpretation that the analyst's hypothesis was on track as to what was the unconscious conflict, and then organize it within a theoretical framework? In other words, describe what took place in sessions and examine transference? Or was this, as some people thought, a violation of the privacy of Jung's vas bene claustrum? Would this, as some feared, make the analytic space no longer a safe space if sessions and what took place was going to be published? Would it be preferable for the journal to publish papers that evoked a situation, that gave an impression from felt experience of what the sessions was like, amplify the material from the objective unconscious, and then formulate a hypothesis as to what was happening, linking this to a theoretical construct, less personal, but more in the spirit of analytical psychology, as experienced by this Zurich-trained analyst? Now, to many of the London-trained members, this approach was too impressionistic, which translates as full of unrecognized countertransference. Bear in mind that countertransference in this discussion at this time was being used as if it was an identifiable counter to transference, known about by the analyst, rather than its actual meaning of the analyst's unrecognized transference. Fordham favored a more scientific approach, but editors have to be flexible. And there's an interesting exchange between Fordham and Jung, in which Jung alerts Fordham to the fact that a paper by Meyer that Fordham was thinking of published contained a fundamental misconception of synchronicity. Meyer identified it with a shamanistic magical transference, implying a causal effect for what we would now call a transference cure. Fordham replied to Jung that he wanted to be hospitable to a paper from Zurich, and he didn't want to humiliate Meyer with too much criticism of his paper. And Jung replied by saying that if you publish, you're setting Meyer up, and this isn't fair. In the event, Fordham let the paper stand, and it was published without alterations or commentary. I wonder if our readers today read papers carefully, because nobody paid a lot of attention to this. You may ask, well, what's the scientific rigor in this? To Fordham, the science was in Jung's theory, the error in Meyer's misinterpretation. But while he agreed with Jung that Meyer was wrong, he had a generous secondary thought. And I think this is something that all editors probably become aware of in trying to help authors publish their papers. He said to Jung, I feel all of us have made blunders from time to time, and it's possible to be grateful to people for correcting them, so long as it's done in a constructive and sympathetic way. I feel myself that Meyer is onto something which might prove interesting, which is that the causal relation, behind the causal relation, there's also a synchronistic one in the transference. And I think he may have been reaching after this without hitting the mark. Now, this reflection of Fordham brings to mind the task of being a good editor, namely seeing what the author is trying to achieve and help the author realize it. And I'm hoping some of our editors are going to talk to us about that. In the Fordham archive at the Wellcome Foundation is a letter from Fordham to Plout. Fordham has just turned down an article of Ardler's. This is always a sensitive issue. And Ardler's complained to the training analysts, and he suggests it's significant that Fordham turned his paper down. Fordham replies, well, it's one of a number which have been rejected because they are in the nature of a lecture, either to students or to the general public. Presidential addresses to learned societies have also been rejected, and I told Ardler that that was the reason, and I said I thought spring would be a more suitable placement. So I saw no reason to alter journal policy. But I much appreciated Ardler's desire to give the journal the first chance. Ho hum. As you will see, this letter implied that the editorial policy is, this is the letter from Ardler, implied that the editorial policy is determined by the English group, evidently at the expense of other groups. As you know, I have strenuously contested this idea, and I believe it has no foundation. So these are the issues that are characterizing the early years and proved to be something that lived on for quite a long time. Into this discussion came Thomas Kirsch, the son of Fordham's analyst, and he thought there was a political dimension in this. Kirsch was involved in the politics of the IAAP for many, many years, and he thought that in the early years, the tension between the IAAP and the journal amplified each other. What he was picking up was that apart from Ardler, no SAP member had ever served as an IAAP president. This has changed, of course. And he said, I think that this occurred because the SAP for a long time was, this is him, I don't agree with this, was isolated from the other major Jungian societies, and that the developmental orientation which the SAP espoused was slow to be accepted in this wider Jungian world. Even at the time that Ardler was elected, there was already an impending split in London between the more Zurich-orientated group and Michael Fordham's focus group. So Kirsch is setting up a political dimension. But then Ardler, as you know, left and set up the AJA. The AJA exploded because of power and personal issues. And at that point, Kirsch revises his view, and he says, well, maybe personalities had something to do with this, not just theoretical differences. The Zurich analysts, he reminds us at this point, had to bow to Jung, who, although at that time had intellectual interests that focused on medieval alchemy, very much wanted the Londoners included, as he appreciated the clinical focus that they professed. These discussions, surprisingly, were picked up by Time magazine. And although Jung in Time magazine didn't come down on the side, he didn't publicly make a statement saying he supported Fordham and his group, he made it perfectly clear to the journalists that he favored the more progressive wing, fearing that his movement would die if it became too introverted and parochial. So Jung supports Fordham, who remained the editor until 1971. But the issues don't go away. Anne Casement, who has written about the history of the journal and the history of the SAP, investigated some of these assertions of Kirsch's that traditional Jungian themes were not welcome in the journal and found this not to be true. She flip-flopped a bit, Anne. I mean, sometimes she thought they were something, but on the whole, her final view was that Kirsch's attacks were not true. And her view was that Fordham's aim was not to supersede the classical Jungian approach, but to marry the two so that each informed the other. What is not disputed is that the JAP under Fordham became influential in establishing a London school of Jungian analysis that paid attention to the child and the adult and investigated the practice of analysis. Fordham's own contributions, of course, were significant, not just his proposal of the dynamic of the self, but also his example of the formulation of the syntonic countertransference within analytic practice, and his concept of not knowing beforehand, and the analyst's knowledge as a filing cabinet. During these years, the JAP was open to authors who wanted to explore ideas as diverse as neuroscience, trauma, psychosomatic states, emergence, and literature. He set a tone that was rigorous, not exclusive, but to those whose papers failed the rigorousness test, it seemed to them that there was a bias towards a definite point of view. My view is that the JAP encouraged diversity, but preferred papers that were written in the style of a scientific paper, where evidence led the argument. Looking at the source of the articles, authors came from Jungian groups all around the world, albeit mainly from Europe and America. And such was the familiarity with the issues of the relations between analytical psychology and psychoanalysis that at the 2001 IAAP conference in Cambridge, I was able to give a keynote address focused precisely on this. 5 years into Fordham's tenure, the journal is publishing 2 issues a year. That's 20 articles. We now have a section that reports on members' publications, which was also added, and papers could be submitted in languages other than English, and at the end of the papers in English, there would be a short synopsis in German. In an editorial 11 years into his role as the editor, Fordham said, "It's one of Jung's greatest achievements to have formulated the results of analytical researches so as to reach into every aspect of human experience, in particular psychiatry, anthropology, religion, art, history, and the social sciences, thereby forwarding the development of insights and approaches that are reciprocally illuminating." In line with the empirical method of analytical psychology, the aim of the journal is to stimulate theoretical and observational studies, primarily in the clinical, but also in other relevant fields, and to act as a forum for interdisciplinary discussion for all those interested in the development of Jung's ideas. This is his assertion, this is his wish, this is what he tried to achieve. The next question that he was asked was, would you publish experimental and statistically based research? And he said, well, he didn't see any value in deploying statistical and experimental methods for their own sake, because method alone cannot produce science, and unconscious processes cannot be grasped by statistical methods. That's a fairly typical Fordham remark. As I am someone who's identified with the work of Fordham, I'll refer here to a way his approach has been criticized. By emphasizing empiricism and the development of the ego, it has been said that his work is an example of the mythic mother-hero struggle, with empiricism taking on the heroic role at the expense of the imagination. I don't agree with this, but state to show that it is possible to reformulate a contribution to development of Jung's ideas in terms that repackage them as not really Jungian, as the author has their own bias. In this instance, that the ego and imagination are opposed. So my theme is that the start of the JAP brought into focus the very different groups of Jungian analysts, and that their orientations depended very much on where they were trained. This led to a book which we all know and probably all have read, which is Andrew's book, in which he describes Jung and the post-Jungians and orders these discussions into a school. He joined in the discussion in the JAP in about 1983, and recognized in what he said that, of course, to talk of Jungians and post-Jungians and of schools of Jungians is itself a contentious matter. And we all he reminded us that Jung said that he was the only Jungian. Samuel's work on this developed into his widely read book, which addresses many of the issues briefly touched on today. Not least Jung's paradoxical injunctions, on the one hand wanting us to be rigorous in our scientific approach, on the other valuing being unsystematic intentionally. And Samuel's reviewed the existing classification of schools and introduced his own based on theoretical and clinical ideas. The three theoretical ideas are the definition of the archetypal, the concept of the self, and the development of the personality. And the three clinical aspects, the analysis of transference and countertransference, the emphasis upon the symbolic experience of the self, and the examination of highly differentiated imagery. These have been themes that have been developed within the journal, and I hope our editors will pick up on that. But parenthetically, Andrew notes, and what we well understand, which is that any classification is to an extent a creative falsehood, that there are likely to be many individuals who don't fit these descriptions, and for some temperaments, classification is seen as being of little value, or even as destructive to the individuality of a person. Classification is itself suspect, as each writer, secretly or openly, favors the group he knows best. Fred Plout, Judith Habbuck took over. They followed a similar pattern. They introduced more elements. The journal is getting more, we're getting more copies of the, I mean, we're getting, sorry, more editions are being published. Plout's tenure ended with him asking, I want to ask you three questions and hope that the journals, as it goes forward, will consider this. Who or what are you? Who was your most influential analyst, and what do you believe in? Has this been a feature of subsequent editions and editors? The
James?
JAP changed publishers, and then in 1991, right, has it been sufficiently international? I should just say we get more international. We get French, German, Italian, and Spanish translations and abstracts, and of course, a big input from the Americans. At this point, John, over to you.
John, you
Can't
need
hear
to
John.
unmute yourself.
Thank you. What a mantle to pass. I think I'm a little bit invisible, so let's just see. Can you see me all fine?
I can see it, John.
Well, I got asked to be the first US editor, and I think there was a motive beyond my personal talents or interest in analytical psychology, which is that I had started a journal in San Francisco that we'd never had a journal. And that was influenced by Michael Fordham, because he had said, there are lots of people doing clinical work in San Francisco, but they never tell us what they do. And so I thought that it would be good to have a journal that gave some stimulation to our membership. And for various reasons, it took off. We had some very good advice as to how to market a journal. And for a brief period, we had a much larger circulation than the Journal of Analytical Psychology in terms of individual subscribers. And that was attractive. And so I was invited in, but maybe I could help us, this journal, Journal of Analytical Psychology, have reach readership. I was thrilled for a number of reasons, one of which I've already said in the promo for this conference, that I had already been reading the Journal of Analytical Psychology since my psychiatric residency at Stanford. I became an ardent reader in 1968, and I would be very excited by what I read, and I liked what I read, and I felt from the beginning the creativity and range of the journal so I did not buy into the later notion that it was simply one school of thought, because the early issues had papers by John Layard and others that I still use in my practice every day. John Layard's essay on bore sacrifice, which Michael Fordham published, and Prince on the meaning of the homosexual transference, and lots of other things that were really very interesting, that were very creative and avant-garde for their day. So when I came aboard, Rosemary Gordon invited me, and she knew she would not be long in the editorship. And soon enough, I was joined by Colleen Covington and Barbara Wharton. And I could not have had better luck. I feel I've had much good luck in my life. And getting these two people to work with was extraordinarily good. And I want to say just a word about Colleen Covington, because she did so much for the Journal of Analytical Psychology. One thing she did was get a new cover, and that marvelous image of the snake uh, that she put on the cover of the Journal of Analytical Psychology, which you can all see. Now, this is actually found in Jung's collected works, but it's not what he says it means, as is often the case with Jung. Jung was not exactly a scholar. He called himself not only an amateur, but a dilettante, and it showed at times, because Jung led us to believe that this coiled up snake was Shiva, when in fact we didn't figure it out. We loved the cover, but we didn't figure out what it meant. But toward the end of her life, Colleen was able to encourage me to locate the actual meaning of it, of the image. And I finally found it in C.G. Jung's biography and books by Sonu Shamdasani. And there it is. It's the cover of Arthur Avalon's The Serpent Power. And it turns out not to be an image of Shiva, but of Shakti. And it has something to do with the rise of the feminine up the Kundalini path through the energies. And what a beautiful image of esse in anima. What a beautiful essay of the idea that what is emerging in the form of psychological consciousness is very much from the early seat in the arms of the mother, the later development of the anima, the entire range of the feminine. And Colleen's intuition picked up on that and put it on the cover. And if you read the Journal of Analytical Psychology through this feminine perspective, you'll see again and again and again how often the creative anima and a powerful sense of the early mother-infant relationship, which, not that those are the same things, the mother and the anima are two different things, but they're both on the feminine side, and how extraordinarily present they are in the clinical articles. They're not just dry cross-fertilization of analytical psychology and psychoanalysis, as was originally claimed, or not just simply neo-Kleinian. There's something else entirely. The spirit of them is intensely Jungian and actually fills in the blanks. So I find the journal still to this day an extraordinarily creative place. But being English and empirical and clear in the use of language, it can also be a daunting place to submit a paper to. Um, it has produced a kind of gold standard or silver standard, perhaps, of how a paper can be written that really tells you what it's about in a very systematic way. And I'd like to call attention to what I consider Goethe would look for the flower, I guess, as a person who's been involved in the editing of a couple of journals and a number of books. I'm always looking for the article that sort of defines what an article should look like, because people are often wondering, what is your standard? And the JAP sets a very fine standard. And I've chosen a paper of yours to represent that, because it's a paper that was published in well, you sent it in November 2007, and it achieved a final version in September 2008, and it was published in February 2009. So that gives you a sense of the speed with which these things are processed by the journal, which is itself a value. But the title is Jung, Vitalism, and the Psychoid, an Historical uh, Reconstruction. And it begins with an extremely clear abstract saying what you're going to talk about, and what will be there. There are keywords that are really keywords. There's a nice, clear introduction. There's a good section on the etymology of the word psychoid, which I learned so much about, and I invite people to look at this. And then there's a section on Dresch's concept of das Psychoid, a kind of neuter uh, article to define what the psychoid is, and this idea of a kind of energy that is filled with energy but doesn't distinguish psyche and body, but rather are the same, which of course takes us to vitalism. And then there's the section on Jung and vitalism, and you show how Jung was into vitalism as early as the time of the Sophingia lectures. It was all through this next section on Jung's dissertation. Then you talk about the case of hysteria that is involved in Jung's really first uh, exploration of that, and how different that is from Freud in some way because of the source of the energy. Then Freud and Jung at their first meeting. Then Bleuler's concept of psychode, which is now we get a feminine image of the psychoid, and that's very important, that gender distinction as opposed to a neutral distinction. Then Jung's concept of the psychoid unconscious, wonderfully developed, comes a discussion, a conclusion, translation of the abstract into French, German, Italian, Spanish, and references. I invite anyone who ever wants to talk about the psychoid to start with that paper. And when you've read that paper, you see so much, including the fact that Jung was already walking into his first letters to Freud, let alone his first meeting with Freud, with a very strong sense of where psychic energy comes from. And it was a very different idea than Freud's. And so you can see the beginning of the two strands that we've been talking about, the Freudian and the Jungian, and how different they were from the beginning, and how valuable the psychoid is. Now, Colleen did much more for our journal, and Barbara along with her. And so they talked often, and they would talk to me. Uh, Something that Colleen really was interested in was that we would have conferences in which this is a sequence. And the conferences could bring together psychoanalysts from other schools as well as Jungian analysts. And so we began to have the conferences. I organized the first one in Sebasco, Maine in 1996. And those conferences have turned out to be incredibly important. Um, the other thing, and concurrent with that same, and I think Barbara and Colleen deserve credit for this, the decision to create a Michael Fordham Prize. And sure enough, the first paper that won the Michael Fordham Prize was by Giles Clark. And this paper is all about the psychoid. And it's an incredibly interesting and also enormously difficult paper. It's the exact opposite of the linear, beautiful, almost Holbein clarity of line of your paper, but it is also an astonishing paper, and I can't imagine another journal that would have even published it, and yet it's so exciting because there he gets right at the spirit of what the Hindu idea, Shakti, was trying to get at in the serpent power that Arthur Avalon popularized. Um, the title was The Animating Body, Psychoid Substance as a Mutual Experience of Psychosomatic Disorder. I don't know another journal in the world that could have published this paper, and yet it's an absolute description by Giles Clark, who uh, was in Sydney, Australia, of what happened between him and a patient where they were really sharing an unconscious matrix with all kinds of synchronicities, including the patient bringing in almost the exact material of a dream that Giles Clark had had before ever meeting the patient, and that had been terribly important in his own analysis. It was right in the patient's material, and they met around extraordinarily painful shared experiences of early body and early mind shared in a mutual relationship that was more than neurotic. You really understood what Jung meant when he said an analysis is like an artificial psychosis under controlled conditions, because what happened between them could have been described by a psychiatrist as almost psychotic, but it was not a folie à deux. It was an experience of what, drawing on the philosophy of Spinoza, Giles Clark calls substance. And by that he meant there's a substantial uh, reality to the embodied psyche at the earliest possible level. And he charts how it went through uh, an amazingly difficult transference, countertransference that involved also, as some of Jung's cases did with similarly disturbed patients, with a physical attack on Giles himself by the analyst by the patient. And yet, what they did together, going through this together, was animating. And he talks about animation not just in terms of the anima, but in terms of animal symbolism and what it may mean, and how one almost gets the vitalist history of animated being itself in the shared transference. It's quite a venturesome paper, and I think it set the stage for what was possible for the journal to do. One of the things that I got, two things Barbara Wharton gave. One was echoing Michael Fordham saying that when analysts write about what they do in their practice, they should really say what they really do. And it's so easy to write about a theory and illustrate the parts of an analysis that illustrate that theory and never really tell what you were actually doing with the client, what the client was doing with you. I have to say that setting that bar is very, very high. I think I have to say that it was at one of these conferences held in San Francisco when with the uh, invitation of, among others, Michael Horn, who was at that time the American editor, I finally achieved that in one of my own clinical papers, Psychotherapy in the Aesthetic Attitude, in which you couldn't be more explicit about what you really do, at least I couldn't be, than I was in that paper. And I felt the absolute permission of the Journal of Analytical Psychology to uh, describe how I interacted and what I said and what I did with the patient. I'm so grateful, and I felt that I was so grateful that it was published and it was the space made for what we're really doing is also the space made for the creativity of the analytical process itself. Because if Clark is right and the psychoid connection between the analyst and the patient is at the heart of the transference and some rise of the kundalini up many chakras of consciousness, they may become psychological types later, they may become first half of life or even second half of life development. But the creativity of the enterprise is critical to its animation, and that does lead us to a form of suffering. The other thing that both Colleen and Barbara supported strongly was letting me help them with setting up a conference. So that first conference where Colleen told me the cast that she wanted me to invite people on the Freudian side who were opening up things that had been important to analytical psychology as well. And so I was on the phone talking to Arnold Modell, Owen Rennick, James Grotstein, a number of people. Some accepted, some did not accept. But I remember very well uh, uh, my first conversation with Arnold Modell. And he said, well, I'm interested to hear from you because I was in Holland. And of course, he'd been writing about the self from a psychoanalytic point of view. But, I've got to tell you, I have a prejudice because I did meet people in Holland. They were talking excitedly about what Jung had said about the self. But what about the anti-Semitism, And Maher Madel, I don't know if I can go to a Jungian conference. And he didn't say as a Jewish man, but he was clearly saying that also. And I said, and was able to say, because when I was first invited, I had been its editor, I was able to say, well, you know, um, we really have dealt with that in the journal because we published the article by Andrew Samuels in 1992, National Psychology, National Socialism, and Analytical Psychology, Reflections on Jung and Anti-Semitism. And we've really been looking hard at this and hard at how what Jung said could be interpreted and what he might have meant and where he felt went. And so we worked on this. And he said, well, if you've been looking at it, then I want to come to the conference. And when he came to the conference, he said, and we had the discussion and he gave his paper. We had a panel. Beverly Zabriskie was there and Arnold Modell, James Grotstein. Of course, I was there, Colleen, others. And Arnold Modell said, I want to tell you all that when I talked to John, I told him I have a prejudice against Jung because of this. But when he explained to me what he did, I felt I could come, and I'm really glad I came. But there was this issue, and Beverly Zabriskie said, "Well, you can find in what Jung said in the 30s things that you won't that are there, and it has a lot to do with his lingering feelings about Freud." And that was said. Other things were said, and at that point, James Grotstein intervened as only he could. He said, who among us is not anti-Semitic? I will never forget that as long as I live. And I felt at that moment the worst part of the Freud-Jung split had ended in that meeting held that I helped to organize. And it wasn't because I helped to organize it, it's because the Journal of Analytical Psychology had already made a space for this. So I guess you get a head of steam when you've had some successes. So then I had the other side of it, which is the responses to our articles are very, very important. And you never know when you say something, it'll be responded to. And when you write something, it'll be responded to. So I had taken from the journal, I had started in San Francisco and into an idea of how one edits, which is a lot more hands-on than the JAP had been used to. And the essay that I tried it out the hardest on was Andrew's essay, because there was some question about could it be published in its original form and so forth. And I said, let me work with Andrew on it. And so I worked on this paper with him, and I went through paragraphs, and uh, I've and Andrew was very excited by what he called my engaged editing. And so he actually published some of the original and some of what I had done to say things in a different way that I thought would make the points work better. And we show that. So I made that a piece of this paper I tried to write on editing as a psychological practice. And that was published in June 2006, and you can all read that. Um, 2 issues later, uh, my paper got an absolutely marvelous, but also absolutely devastating critical response from Susan Greenberg. And she she said, I was really looking forward to this paper on what psychological editing would be. And John Beebe talked about this engaged editing and really getting into it with the author and trying to make sure that the meaning came across and so forth. And she said, but this is like a generic definition of any editor. She didn't like the paper at all in that sense, because it didn't tell her anything she didn't already know. She was an experienced editor. But I have to say that at that point, I kind of went to heaven, because it was the moment when someone realized that I had at least become an editor. And then she did what's as much which I couldn't possibly have done. She talked about editing in the most exquisite way, about how analysts are not the only people who try to get at, through dialogue, what people really mean, and to try to advance meaning itself. That analysis is one way to advance that. So is editing. So and so is responding. And so I want to just say in a moment that I think we have, the best paper I ever heard at these conferences that I had a role in organizing with at the behest of Colleen and Barbara was the one in Merida by Joyce McDougall, that she published under a title that doesn't fully convey what the paper contains, Theaters of the Psyche. But I still remember being in Merida when she gave the paper. It's an incredibly moving paper about a woman who feared cancer her entire life and then gets cancer and eventually dies of cancer. And the same process Jules Clark is talking about, comes back in that paper. And I still remember Beverly Zabriskie gave a wonderful response, because the patient was Jewish, and Beverly picked up on the intergenerational aspect of the suffering. But I remember that despite Beverly's response and our talking, there was a missed opportunity at the Merida conference, which, as I'll tell you in a minute, James Astor helped us with later. But the Joyce Gajugel looked at us, and she had been talking about going back to that idea of substance. There was this the woman would have thoughts that she was cancer. She would also see the breast cancer inside herself. And it was almost like a strange black oil. She talked about many different things. She's a very intelligent client. And she and Joyce McDougall had a real mutual process between them going. But Joyce McDougall telling us in Meredith, she said, Well, I rather thought Jungians would really respond a little more to this than I've heard here. And I felt like, well, you don't want to raise your hand now, and you don't want to call attention to yourself, so I didn't say anything. I still regret that. It was a missed opportunity, and I feel bad about that. Because what I would have liked to say is that Joyce McDougall gave us in that paper the clearest symbol of what Jung refers to as absolute evil in Ion when he says it's a rare and shattering experience to look in the face of absolute evil. And that was exactly what this client, who had been sort of born into an intergenerational malignancy, she did refer to the phantom of earlier feelings so that she knew that she was dealing with what Sam Kimball's, who's part of this conference, later called a phantom narrative, which he thinks is at the core of any cultural complex and especially of intergenerational complexes. Fortunately, Joyce McDougall didn't stop talking to Jungians. I'm so glad she came to London, talked, and I found going over the journal that she had talked and that you responded to her, James, in London. And your response really does touch all the bases of how how safe is it to get close? How good is it? How bad is it? How creative is it? How much is it a defense? I mean, it's a wonderful series of questions that are asked in an open-ended way so that you give Joyce McDougall all the credit she deserves and give the case all the questions it deserves. And you got a lot closer, I think. Uh, but I still feel like we have this fantasy sometimes that we Jungians read the psychoanalysts, but the psychoanalysts don't read us. In fact, what we found with those early uh, conferences is they want to talk to us. And sometimes we hold back. And I still remember myself not sharing Jung's comment on absolute evil, which Joyce McDougall would have loved to have heard someone speak to. And there she had the best, as I say, image of it. So the Fordham Prize goes on. The most recent has been given to an absolutely splendid paper by my colleague in San Francisco, uh, Robert Tominski, uh, who takes on the entire phenomenon that our current American president tried to resolve by simply saying there are only two genders, as it is inaugural. But we have young people all over the world, a very large percentage of them, which think of the polarities that Jung made so much of, masculine and feminine, and um, man and woman, and animus and anima, that polaristic thinking. Robert's paper is humanizing different archetypal expressions of gender expressiveness. And he he talks about a lovely idea of not only gender expressiveness and transgressivity, which we can all relate to, but also a kind of expansiveness, of gender expansiveness. It's kind of a wonderful thing what analytic language can do. The minute you see that many young people today, and I see them, we all see them in our practices, are trying to expand on the notion of gender. And it's not a question of switching over so much as it is or simply transitioning, but really opening up a spectrum. And the fact that the Journal of Analytical Psychology gave the Fordham Prize to this exquisite opening paper with some of the most sensible paper by a man who really has the experience with the adolescent of today. Makes me feel that the Journal of Analytical Psychology is just great journal filled with treasures in which every kind of work with patients, every attitude toward the patients and their development is open to discussion. And let me thank the editors who also did me the favor of turning down a paper I wrote when I was editor. And let me say that that rejection of that paper helped me make a better paper, and it got published in a book by Ann Casement, who I wish could be here to thank. But I benefited tremendously also from being rejected as well as accepted as an editor, rejected as an author. It made me a better writer. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me today.
James and John, thank you both so much for sharing such richness of our past and opening up so much for us. Really very special. Thank you. It would be very nice if some of the editors, past editors, might feel that they could leap into the discussion at this point, maybe with their thoughts on their experience of the editorial process, or changes in it, or possibly authorial intransigence, to borrow James's words, as potential thinking. It would be lovely if you feel able to leap in at this point before I open up more generally to comments and questions generally.
First, I want to thank you and your co-editors for putting together this conference. I think it's an important one. And I think that James did a very nice job on giving the anamnesis of the journal itself. And then I think, John, you offered a kind of anamnesis of the journal as a community. And from my experience, those conferences in Maine were extremely important in terms of bringing together people from various fields of psychoanalysis with Jungian psychology. I think they were extremely successful. Joe was involved in that along with Barbara Wharton and Colleen, as we've said. And I think that repair often happens at the local level. And I think that that is enormously important to think about in this day and time with a world that is so fractured and in distress. And I also wanted to mention, we did a conference, I think 2014, I guess, in Boston on attachment that included points of view from contemporary infant research, as well as from analytical psychology and early relational trauma. And since it was in Boston, we had invited Gene Taylor to give the keynote because his area of interest was on William James. And our thought would be, it would be lovely for him to present actually in the old William James house. That wasn't possible. But sadly, he died. Gene Taylor died just before the conference. So we're in a tough situation to figure out what to do. And Joe and I had known Mal Slavin, who had founded the Mass Institute of Psychoanalysis and has been very big in relational analysis. He willingly came forward at the last minute and gave a very fine paper that I think was quite appealing to Jungians. His area of interest in the deeper background is evolutionary biology, and that went very well, and it was a very collaborative effort. I also think in terms of community about a conference we had in St. Petersburg that Warren and I were involved in doing. And at the end, in terms of working with the audience with feedback, a very lovely German man bravely stood up and tearfully apologized for what those from his country had done to the Russian people in the siege of Leningrad. It was so profound that there was absolute silence when he finished speaking. It was incredibly moving. So I think the journal not only publishes important papers and brings together a variety of different ideas from different fields, but it also offers a community and a holding environment for collaboration. And finally, I would just like to say I'm very happy that the journal has included the film and culture section that I've been involved in. It's something dear to my heart. And at first, I was interested in the journal because I was originally psychoanalytically trained, and the traditional Jungian views that I was learning about in my training in the US weren't working for me so well. But at this older time in my life, in my 70s, I've gotten interested in Jungian methods such as active imagination and amplification, and I'm looking at ways of integrating those. So I think the journal has a very broad umbrella that includes these kinds of things. And I think art and culture are in some ways offer more psychology at times than psychology textbooks, for example. So I think bringing various things together as a whole is extremely important. And I think that the whole is much greater than the sum of its parts, that we as a community, all kinds of things emerge and come into being. So I'm very grateful to the JAP and to the editors, and wish everyone well going forward. And finally, I'd like to note the administrative editors, going back to Cantu, a lovely lady that John and Joe knew. She was wonderful. And then, of course, Pramila Bennett, and now Jane, who is an ace as far as I'm concerned. They are kind of the hub of holding together the community in so many ways. So I offer my thanks to them.
Thank you,
We've
Linda.
left something out that we might bring in.
John?
The book review section. Uh,
Yes.
you know, there are many books one buys and doesn't read, or the books that one reads about and doesn't buy, and whatever. But I would love, James, to say that I have read your contributions to Michael Fordham book, but I did read a marvelous review of it by Sam Nafee when he was the American reviews editor, and Sam lists every single one of Michael Fordham's innovations with 13 points. So I feel as if I could probably talk as if I read your book. But the most important thing is that the reviews of the journal are really interesting reviews that enable us to keep up with the field in a very creative way. They're very special reviews, and there's a lot of information in them. So just thank the reviews editors too, because they've done a tremendously good job over the years. Sam Nafee being a particular one.
I agree with you, John. I work very closely with Sam on that, so I'm very glad he got it right. But you're completely right. I do think that the book section is very helpful and is excellent, particularly the synopsis of the books and give you a sense of what it is, and whether
And
you want to take
occasionally
that
even
further.
journal articles are reviewed, which is
Yeah,
amazing. It's really
yeah.
quite an amazing section. So what a lot is in each issue. So that's the thing.
Mm.
Yeah. I'm
Joe,
glad,
would you
glad
like
you
to
reviewed.
speak? Over to you,
Yeah.
Joe.
Okay. Um, for me, one of the most valuable and exciting things about the journal over the years has been its capacity for innovation. You know, I came in as the second U.S. editor following John, and it was an enormously exciting time. I joined Barbara and Colleen, and the vision of conferences really was a way of really beginning to bring in new voices with and new perspectives that would enlarge and expand the community. And it went in a direction that was particularly interesting in that we also turned to history. Not only did we turn toward psychoanalysis, but Barbara and Colleen published all that material on Spielrein. We did a special issue on that. And that caused Tom Kirsch and I to get into a close conversation. And the C.G. Jung Institute of San Francisco then hosted a series of history conferences the papers were published in the journal. And that brought us people like Ernst Falzeder in, who is now one of the key editors at Philemon. And the sense of integrating our history not only of the journal itself, but the larger IAP community, and then the whole field of depth psychology. And by the way, just one little minor addition: the Robert Moody actually was president of the IAP for a transitional year, the first year before they had a Congress. He stepped in. Unfortunately, he died. He had an allergic reaction to being stung by bees. It was a very sad story, but right there at the very beginning of the IAP, there was a member of the SAP in the leadership role, even if it's a transitional role. Um, and that question of the link between the international and the journal, it seemed to me was something that we were able to expand during the period. I then worked with Jean Knox. She came in and we had a very fruitful time because both of us had a fairly strong scientific background, and we were able to turn towards contemporary movements in science and begin to see how they might help us. For me, it was a transition. I started in 97 and I went through 2005. And so what it was spanning the millennia. It was like, how do we get from here to there? That would seem to me part of the task that we on the editorial staff are looking at. What does our discipline look like as we move into the 21st century, which in many ways, the inclusion of neuroscience and the work on trauma and the brain sciences more generally had to be included in the vision that was moving forward. And we were able to get specialist advisors. We were able to extend our translations into more languages like Russian and Chinese. And what we were seeing is a kind of internationalization. And it was really very exciting to watch the journal embrace that the sense of diversity that was at the heart of, I think, the Jungian method was able to find a new flowering. I went back to that when we had the 50th anniversary. Now we're moving on from that. But at the 50th anniversary, I went back and read that first issue of the JAP and was delighted to find a number of the articles that had already been mentioned. And there's also a little thing by Jung. He's read about cybernetics and he starts talking about the self-regulating function of the psyche in that very first issue. And I'm thinking, my goodness, this is really at the forefront of what's happening in kind of contemporary scientific thinking of the time. And there he is, he's got it in the first issue. He's bringing that kind of vision and vitality. And I think that's something for me that the journal picks up and can carry forward is where this is moving in a larger sense in the communities. And I think watching the evolution of the editorships, I feel very encouraged myself in how those directions are moving. And now in the good hands it seems to be in as we progress forward. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what's going to be said at the conference. Although in California it's going to be hard tomorrow because even our thing is at 5:45 in the morning.
Thank you, Joe. We have just a couple of minutes left. Susanna, you haven't spoken, and therefore, if you wish to, would you like to?
Well, I think my role might be as echo because there are some things that I very much resonated to. I wanted to echo to Linda's point about particularly the ones I've experienced, Pramila Bennett and Jane Turney, who have been the absolute backbone of the journal over many, many years. And, you know, the editors come and go, but they have stayed and really provided a consistency. And I'd like to echo to Warren's and Joe's thoughts about, you know, the international quality. That was a real experience for me, editing the journal, getting so much more exposure to the international arena and working on some of those papers. They really could take hours and hours.
Yes.
But to get that sense of a voice coming from a very different culture, and it was so fresh and so interesting, and to translate our own ideas into, you know, how they were being experienced and interpreted in different countries and under different regimes was really fascinating and so educational. And finally, I'd like to end on a light note by just remembering the comma wars, which we had during the editorship with David and William when we worked hard at the referencing. I remember when the comma wars started, thinking, oh, this is so tedious. I don't know if I can stand this. But actually, it was a very great thing that we really ironed out some of the inconsistencies and disparities that were going on. And between the three of us, by the end of the period that I was in it, we were doing some pretty sound referencing. So yeah, I hope that's continued through generations since.
Thank you, Susanna. I'm afraid I'm going to have to stop any further comments because we've arrived at the end of today. I'm really looking forward to tomorrow after today. Thank you, all of you, for contributing after James and John opened. Thank you, James and John, very much for your contributions today, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Good night.